Hello everyone, and welcome to today's TPC Training public webinar entitled Building a Qualified Worker Program in Your Facility. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm a product manager with TPC Training, and I've also been an instructor with our company on the road teaching our electrical courses throughout the last 5 years or so. I've been in the industry about 12 years now, and I've gotten to see a lot of the different things going on in the electrical side of things. So I'm here to talk to you about the latest and kind of break down the latest ideas behind what does it really mean to be qualified? What does it mean to be a qualified electrical worker in particular in your facility? So before I get into the meat and potatoes of this presentation, I really want to make it clear that this webinar is live in this moment here on December 12th, 2019, and also that it is able to be interactive. So what I want everyone on this call to be aware of is that you can use the chat box. It's over to the far right of your toolbar for Zoom here, and if you click chat and you type a message to panelists or type a message to me, Ryan Smith. Be careful not to send a chat message to all attendees and everyone will see it, but you can send the questions to me, and then by the end of my session, I should be able to answer some of your questions and really have a Q&A session with whoever's on the chat line. So without further ado, really, I'll get into the meat and potatoes of this. One other thing I want to mention before I do is that this webinar is being recorded, and this recording will be posted onto our website and sent to you via email within 2 business days of today's webinar. And also a copy of this presentation will be made available to everyone who is on this webinar today. So thank you for being here, and let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be a qualified electrical worker. The main Bible, so to speak, for all things qualified is, well, 2 documents, but the one we're going to really focus on today is the NFPA 70E. This is the national standard for electrical safety in the workplace, put forward by the National Fire Protection Agency here, NFPA. This really has hit the big time in the last in this century here, in the 2000s, really since the introduction of specific electrical PPE requirements and arc flash safety requirements. And this really defines our day-to-day operations on the job. The latest version, the 2018 version, was released in late 2017 and is still our current version of the NFPA 70E. So if you go into this standard, this is really going to tell us what the federal government, OSHA, believes is the standard for electrical safety in the workplace. This has been adopted by OSHA as the standard document across the country. Now, this is not the same as the National Electrical Code, which is NFPA 70 without the letter E on it, but they both give their own definitions of what it means to be qualified, and they jive with one another. Okay. And that definition, if you turn to Article 100 of the NFPA 70E, is this. A qualified person out of Article 100 is one who has demonstrated, that's going to be a key word here, demonstrated skills and knowledge relating to the construction and operation of our electrical equipment and installations, and has received safety training, not just any training, but safety training to identify the hazards. And then this highlighted part, and reduce the associated risk. This is the new part of the definition of what it means to be qualified in the 2018 version of NFPA 70E. So now a qualified person not only needs these demonstrated skills and knowledge and the safety training, they need to be able to do a little bit of risk assessment and risk reduction techniques of reducing risk. So breaking this definition down a little bit, right? That means a qualified person, in order to be considered qualified according to the national standard, this qualified person must have skills, knowledge, and safety training before they can start working on electrical equipment, okay? And we're going to break down what these tasks could be toward the end, just as a little activity. But in general, these qualified people are going to be doing live electrical work, whether it mean troubleshooting with voltage measurement on a electrical meter, or doing electrical repair work close to exposed energized conductors, right? This is some serious work. And not only is it difficult work, but it's also extremely dangerous work, right? One small mess up can really be the end of someone's life. So having these proper skills, proper knowledge, proper safety training becomes paramount for these individuals doing this electrical work. But the real question becomes the subjectivity of these three, right? Skills, knowledge, and safety training. How do I know, and how do you know whether you have enough of these in your facility, right? And how do you know whether your facility has set up the ability to have enough skills, knowledge, and safety training? So that's really what we want to talk about. But let's say you're an average worker in your facility, whether it be a maintenance technician or an electrician or a contractor or anything. How can you determine that you're qualified, right? This is, I think, one of my favorite central discussions of any electrical safety class that I teach out there on the road is this question. I really open the floor, is how can you determine you're qualified? And really the first question being is who can determine that you are qualified, right? Who can I turn to determine whether I am qualified to get into that 480 volt cabinet over there, right? And start testing motor starters and control relays and all that fun stuff, right? Who can I turn to? Should I turn to my local jurisdiction, my city, my county, my state? Will they be able to get back to my voicemail and say, hey, yes, you are qualified, or no, you're not? Or maybe it's a licensing agency. Maybe it's some state board or an electrical license, my journeyman's licensed agency, right? Maybe they're the ones who say whether or not we're qualified, right? Or what if it's OSHA, right? OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the federal government's main authority about safety. Maybe they're the ones who can tell us, if I flip through enough of the books and enough of the federal documents, I'll be able to figure out whether or not I'm qualified. Or maybe I can only look within, right? A lot of people I've talked to in the class have been led to believe that you yourself are the only person who can tell you are qualified. And I might even add one more to this list that's not on here, and that is expert electrician, right? You talk to a master electrician and you get their thumbs up that you're qualified, then you're qualified, right? Unfortunately, all of these answers, right? Your local governments, your state governments, your licensing agencies, OSHA, yourself, none of these are correct. None of these people can tell you whether you're qualified or not in your facility to do, let's say, the work on your electrical motors or to get into an electrical cabinet in your facility. So what's the answer? Who can really tell you you're qualified if it's not your own self and it's not OSHA and it's not anyone else? The only answer are these two words, and that is your employer. So what does that mean, right? Your employer is the only one who can determine that you're qualified. And usually for an average person in a maintenance technician role or in an electrician role, the employer to that person is that person's supervisor, right? The representative of that person's employer is their supervisor or their supervisor's supervisor, right? Their department head, basically someone who you report to within your organization are the only people who can tell you whether or not you're qualified. And this might lead you to first raise your eyebrows, and it usually does in the classroom, is what? My manager who doesn't really know they're not even an electrician, let's say. My supervisor's not even an electrician. They don't know anything about electricity. How can they be the ones qualifying me to do electrical work, right? Well, at the end of the day, qualification in your facility is all about liability. Who's going to assume liability for you in the hopefully instance that it never happens, but in the instance that if you get hurt, who's going to take liability? Who's going to take responsibility for you, your safety, and your health? And the only answer is none of these entities up here, but your employer. They're the ones who are overseeing you day in and day out, so they're the ones who can make the call on whether you're qualified and that they feel comfortable enough or confident enough in your abilities, in your skills, knowledge, and safety training, right, to know whether you are qualified. Okay, so your employer. So in other words, if you're not sure whether or not you're qualified, or maybe you thought you were, the only person who has that answer, or the only entity that has that answer, is your own company, your own employer. Okay, so think about who that person might be. It's probably your boss or your supervisor who you can start talking to see whether you are. Okay. Your next question, I'm sure, naturally becomes, well, what does it take to be qualified, right? How do I know whether I'm qualified, or what will it take? What is the requirement to be qualified, right? Well, I just told you the definition of what it takes to be a qualified person. You need skills, you need knowledge, you need safety training, right? However, how do we know when we have enough skills or enough knowledge or enough safety training, right? That's really up to the employer, right? So you can't answer that for yourself. OSHA can't answer that for you. You can't find the answer in NFPA 70 ebook, right? But the only person who can answer that question on whether I have enough skills, knowledge, or safety training to be qualified is the employer, right? So if you go to your employer, you go to your supervisor, the best qualified worker program has a clearly documented set of requirements or prerequisites for what it takes to be qualified in your facility. And it's written down, hopefully on a sheet of paper that you can reproduce at any time, on here's what it takes to be qualified, and you do or you do not meet these requirements. Right? So here's a laundry list of potential requirements your facility could be using now or could use in the future to be a qualified electrical worker, right? Maybe your facility requires completion of a minimum amount of instructor-led training courses, right? Let's say arc/electrical safety every 3 years, or electrical troubleshooting skills class, or how to wire up circuits type of class, or National Electrical Code classes, right? Or maybe your company requires that you complete a certain amount of self-guided online training modules, right? Lockout tagout training, or confined space entry training, fall protection training, or just how to be a good technician in our company because we have a special way of operating in our company, right? Reading of books and binders, right? Textbooks and binders, even though they might be all getting electronic nowadays, still hard copy books and binders are legitimate ways of getting training. How about completion of on-the-job training, right? Where you follow a assigned mentor and you sign off on your progress, right? That's considered a way to gain skills and knowledge. Acquiring or holding an electrician's license in your state, right? Let's say you're considered an electrician in the state of Michigan, and maybe your company requires that that person is considered a licensed electrician in the state of Michigan before they can work as an electrician in their facility, which is in the state of Michigan. Well, let me ask you, just kind of pose this hypothetical question. Can you be qualified but not hold a license? The answer is absolutely yes, right? You don't need any of these one things or any number of these things. Really, it all depends on whatever your employer chooses from this list would be what it takes to be qualified, right? High school diploma, college degree. Some companies do, some companies don't require those to be qualified. Minimum of years with the company, right? Some people have a minimum amount of years requirement where they say you got to work for at least 5 years with our company, or 10 years with our company, or maybe just 1 year or 6 months in our company before we can qualify you. Some might say you need a minimum year of experience, right? So you've been in the field for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years before you can be considered qualified to work on our facility. It doesn't have to have been in our facility, but you must have had, let's say, this many years of electrical experience in the field. And then testing, exams and testing, really an important component that makes it very easy to refer back to assessment and that demonstration. Remember what we saw at the beginning of a definition of what it means to be qualified? It is a demonstrated skills and knowledge. And one really easy and straightforward way to demonstrate someone's knowledge and skills is to take an exam on the topic, right? But another more applicable way to demonstrate skills is to complete hands-on skills assessments where you're running through a checklist of skills and you as a mentor or trainer are watching them perform those skills and checking them off on that. TPC Training obviously offers ways to do hands-on on-the-job training with our mobile forms platform, so you don't ever have to print stuff off. It's kind of fun. But there's basically all sorts of ways to get this skills and knowledge for yourself. And again, which of these do you need in your facility? Ask your employer. That's what it's all about. Which of these apply to you? It's all up to your employer. And if your employer is saying, well, I'm not sure, Well, that's really means for some really good improvement and really good documentation on the part of you or your employer to write up some of these requirements on what you think should be the minimum requirements to be qualified to do live electrical work in your facility. It's important to know your voltage levels first and to know some of the minimum requirements out of the national standards, including NFPA 70E. So you ask your employer, you guys have a talk together, right? And after that, right, how do you know you're qualified? So we asked who you can ask to if you're whether or not you're qualified, and what some potential list of requirements could be. But then how do you know you've met those requirements? How do you know you've finally been able to flip the switch, proverbial switch, to being unqualified to being qualified? Well, a key thing that I'm always going to come back to, and I've been already avoiding saying it until now, is this. If it wasn't written down, it never happened. Plain and simple. If your qualification was never written down on paper and documented and basically signed off by you and your employer, then the qualification never happened. You are technically not qualified until it's been written down and documented. You might say, well, that seems absurd and crazy, but you'll be really glad you documented these qualification requirements as soon as anything safety related comes up in your facility, right? Anytime there's any concerns with injuries or liabilities, it's always important to have a paper trail in your facility. And I'm sure anyone on this call who has had serious or even minor incidents happen in your facility, and how painstaking and how painful it can be to track down what exactly happened and why it was allowed to happen, right? So keeping records and documentation of qualification in your facility is a great way to keep a record of, you know, for liability in your facility, and for also just making sure you have a clear documented set of guidelines for doing electrical work in your facility. People's lives are at stake here. According to NFPA 70E, a proper qualified electrical worker program will include, at the very minimum, a clearly documented set of requirements to be qualified for certain tasks, right? And we're going to talk about in just a second, we're actually, already toward the tail end of what I'm going to present, and then we can open the floor for questions toward the end of this class. Already getting a couple on the chat line, and feel free to continue filling that chat line, so when I'm done in just a couple more slides, we can have a really great talk about this. A clearly documented set of requirements to be qualified for certain tasks. One thing you'll see in NFPA 70E is you could be qualified to do one job, but not qualified to do another. So you could be qualified by your employer to work on, let's say, 24-volt control circuits on your PLCs. But as soon as you open the cabinet to the motor controllers and the motor starters at 480 volts, nope, you're not qualified to do that. We need someone else to do that. Because getting into those cabinets means more PPE requirements that you need to be aware of, more arc flash boundary requirements you need to be aware of, and more of the approach boundary stuff that you need to be aware of. Documentation of the qualification, right? Again, writing down even some sort of typed message of, I, employer X, verify that so-and-so is qualified to work on X, Y, and Z, a bulleted list, sign here. Something as simple as that, okay? Again, if you sat down with your employer and you said, hey, am I qualified to work on these 480 volt motors? And your employer says verbally, yeah, of course, you've been doing it all along, right? You've been doing it these last 6 months. Of course you're qualified, so get back to it. And you go out there and continue working, and let's just, God forbid, you get hurt doing so. That conversation never happened, according to OSHA, who's going to knock on your door, after this incident, because it wasn't documented. I think you get the point. Signature of employee and employer is really, really smart to have and important to have to document your qualifications in the facility. Other considerations. Let's talk about some other wrinkles and other aspects and other angles we can take with the idea of being qualified in a facility. So we learn now that we need skills, we need knowledge, we need safety training, right? Let's talk really quickly about the difference between skills and knowledge, right? Skills being more of a hands-on ability to do the job, right? And how to do the job the best way, the most efficient way. Knowledge being why. Why am I doing the job the way I need to do it, right? So you can know how to do the job and you can do the job repeatedly 100 times without fail. But do you know why you're doing that? Do you know why you connect the blue wire to the blue wire and the white wire to the white wire, and why the white and the green wire need to be connected at the main panel or the source? Do we really know why that is? Because that's where true knowledge comes from, is understanding why. And then safety training, right? You can get electrical training from anyone, including us. However, if it's not specifically arc flash electrical safety or specific to electrical safety, it is not considered a proper safety training. Okay. Something else to consider: use of contractors, right? A lot of our companies, and I suspect at least a few of you on this webinar, use contractors to do your electrical work and don't allow your employees to do that electrical work. Does that mean all liability is transferred away from you into those contract organizations? Absolutely not, unfortunately. And you can look for yourself in Article 110.3 of NFPA 70E. The host facility still holds and shares liability for the contractor safety while on site, to the point where if something bad happens to that contractor while in your facility, it will still be considered something recordable for you. Okay, so you got to be careful about that. Let's talk about retraining, right? Getting refreshed and getting updated on your training to be qualified. The minimum standard in NFPA 70E is that this training must occur at least once every 3 years. In 3 years, why is it that way, right? Why is it every 3 years instead of every 5 years or 10 years or 1 year? Well, it makes sense that it's every 3 years because the NFPA 70E book gets updated every 3 years. So that kind of makes sense for us, doesn't it? That if the book's going to get updated, then before the next book comes around, we need to get trained on this version of the book to keep ourselves updated on the latest safety requirements that all these experts, just like you and me, have drafted in the industry. Remember, NFPA 70E was not written by the government, and it wasn't even written by the NFPA, even though it seems like it was. No, it was written by a huge committee of people doing electrical work all around this country, just like you and me. Electrical installers, electrical maintenance technicians, electrical supervisors, line workers, manufacturing workers, people from all around this country who are experts in their field came together and they all agreed on one thing. Imagine that. Imagine all of us in industry from all different industries agreeing on one thing. That's what NFPA 70E is. That's why it holds so much weight, is because everyone in industry who is represented there agrees on these requirements. So you might think it's a little crazy to have to do all these documentation requirements to be qualified, but all these people agree that that's the best way to assure everyone's safety. And then finally, inspecting electrical work practices, right? So you're inspecting the work practices of your qualified people, using meters correctly, using your gloves and your hard hat and your face shields all correctly. That has to be audited in a documented fashion at least once every year, annually. And that's on 110.2. Training documentation, kind of hitting this again. It must be retained for the entirety of the employee's employment with your company, and also contain the employee's name, topic, and date. So some people use sign-in sheets, which is perfectly acceptable. We use sign-in sheets as a record of your attendee to our classes as well, where if your name and signature and the date and the topic are all shown on the documentation, then that is proof that you were at that session. So you don't need to be all technical about being recorded there, or even having to have taken a test necessarily, until you need that demonstration. That's where tests and exams come in. And then finally, your qualification is not universal. Mentioned this earlier, I'll mention it again. You can be qualified to do one electrical job, but not qualified to do another. So once you reach the status of being qualified at the employer you're at now, that doesn't mean you can walk out the door and work for another employer and be considered qualified there. It's not universal, it's not fully transferred. But also, if you work in, let's say, the high voltage part of your plant, or even just, let's say you work on the extruder line of your plant and you're qualified to work on those machines electrically, and you go over to the furnace lines in your plant, you're not necessarily qualified to work on those machines unless authorized by the employer to do so. So you always got to be, when in doubt, always ask your employer. And in this case, most cases, that means your boss, your supervisor. And if they say verbally yes, then you can always come back and say, well, is it written down somewhere? Can we kind of just have that to look back to? It's always smart to have it written down. All this stuff, it's really worth noting that the NFPA 70E is listing the minimum set of requirements. And I got some great questions from some of you already before this session began yesterday and the last few days. And some people were wondering, you know, is this the be-all end-all standard? Do we have to follow these rules? And the answer is yes, you have to follow these rules, but at the risk of getting fined and cited by OSHA themselves, because OSHA has adopted these standards from NFPA 70E. However, these are considered a minimum standard. Okay, so what I mean by that is your employer can go above and beyond however far they want to from these standards. So maybe your employer requires retraining every 6 months on electrical safety. That's perfectly acceptable to this national standard and within this national standard, because it at least meets the standard of 3 years and it goes above and beyond, right? Maybe your company requires, you know, training documentation that has more information on it than just employee name, topic, and date. Maybe they want a video recording of the people at the plant. I don't know, just some other above and beyond documentation of the training. Absolutely, that is acceptable. So basically, we're just talking about the minimum requirements here. Okay. So that's really what I wanted to get into. I hope I gave you some really good parameters of what a healthy qualification program is all about. You know, this is really what, as far as NFPA 70E, will get into what it takes to be qualified. But I'd like to do one more exercise with you all here, just to kind of jog your brain and have a little fun here. Is I'm going to talk about 3 different tasks. I'm going to show you 3 different tasks, and this jogged my brain to actually put it in here because of someone's comment prior to this webinar that they sent me, in a question that they sent me prior to this webinar. Do you need to be qualified for these tasks? Let's start here. Voltage testing and troubleshooting inside of a panel. Right? Let's say it's a 120 volt panel we see here with a red, blue, and white, and you're testing for voltage in there, got all your PPE on. Do you need to be qualified to do this? And the answer is absolutely yes, right? Anything greater than 50 volts, phase to phase or phase to ground, you need to be qualified to do voltage testing and troubleshooting. And you can look right in Article 110.4a to show that. And I'll take it one step further here. And this will help us with the next task we might need to do, and this is what someone was mentioning, is anytime you are faced with exposed energized conductors, and that you're getting closer than the limited approach boundary to those conductors. And I know you might be crossing your eyes if you haven't taken an arc flash safety class in a while on what the limited approach boundary is, but I'll just say it's within a couple feet or so, right? It could be 3.5 feet, 42 inches for most industrial voltages, like 120 and 480 volts. But if you're getting closer than 3.5 feet to this equipment and it's open and exposed to you, then you must be qualified to work on it, right? Whether you're working near it or on it or testing it, you need to be qualified. What does exposed really mean, right? Some people say, well, I put a plexiglass thing up. That means you don't need to be qualified to take a look at it. That leads to a whole nother rabbit hole of, was it listed and was it built by the manufacturer and listed by the manufacturer? Let's say was that panel or that enclosure or that barrier listed to do what it's doing right now or not? And also a good rule of thumb is OSHA defines guards and guarding and covering of different components, is that if there's more than a 1/4 inch, think of how small a 1/4 inch is, right? If there's more than a 1/4 inch, roughly the width of your pinky finger, of clearance that you can reach into to touch live electrical conductors, those conductors are considered exposed. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you go by an electrical panel that was hit by a forklift or something like that, right, and there's just a little dent and the doors open just so and it won't close tightly, that is considered exposed energized parts, and qualified people need to approach, right? Let's talk about this second task here. Flipping a circuit breaker. This is a common one that we get, right? Do you need to be qualified to flip on and off the circuit breaker? What do you think? Well, the answer is no, you don't need to be qualified under normal circumstances. That's my big caveat here. If there are any signs of damage or impending failure or just really strange operation, anything other than perfectly normal operation, then you do need to be qualified. So let's say you walk up to this circuit breaker you're going to flip and you put your hand up to it and it's hot to the touch, right? Walk away and someone needs to be qualified to flip this, because you never know if there's an arc flash hazard behind this thing. If it's buzzing, right, as you walk up to it, that's signs of impending failure and damage to the equipment. You need to be qualified before you operate that circuit breaker. Let's talk about resetting a motor overload, right? You walked in to your control cabinet and you're going to just press that little button to reset the overloads. Not too bad, right? All you're going to do is open the door and press a little plastic button and then close the door. You don't need to be qualified for that, do you? And the answer is yes, of course you need to be qualified, because as soon as you open that door, you are exposing yourself to 480 volts of phase-to-phase voltage potential. And even though you might not be intending to touch it, it can touch you if, let's say, a wire is loose, or a connection is loose to the point where that arc comes right out at you as soon as you open the door. You don't want to put yourself in harm's way. You need someone who's qualified and knows the proper PPE requirements to protect themselves when opening this door. And this comes back to no unqualified people are ever allowed to enter that limited approach boundary of the equipment. What is a limited approach boundary? Well, I highly recommend you take the arc flash safety class to get more information about approach boundaries in the terms of being qualified. Okay, and that's in NFPA 70E Article 130.4E1 is where they talk about unqualified people in the limited approach boundary. And with that, I think I'll wrap it up for the day. Hopefully you guys got some really good tidbits here on just some of the parameters of what it takes to have a healthy program. We're getting some chat line now, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my chat line and see what kind of fun comments we're getting so far. And let's see, how do you differentiate between trained, qualified, and competent? That's a really good question. So you could be trained but not necessarily qualified. You can be competent but not necessarily qualified, right? So my answer to that would be not all trained people are qualified, but definitely all qualified people are trained. That's what I would say. You definitely need to be trained to be qualified, but some training might get you down the road of some other career path instead of this one. Okay, so that wouldn't be really helpful to get you qualified. So you can get, training on, let's say, HVAC systems, or training on, how to maintain a pump or something like that. That's getting you some great knowledge, but not really getting you along the road of being a qualified electrical worker. So then, how do we know the difference between being trained and being qualified? Who do you ask? Your employer, right? So that's really the only answer to this question is, how do you know the difference between being trained, being competent, and being qualified? Only your employer can answer that question. Once they deem you have enough skills, enough knowledge, and enough safety training that meets their requirements and confidence in your abilities to do this work, then they can do it. Then you can do it for them. Okay. Someone else asked, where will we be able to find the recording of this webinar? And the answer is absolutely on our website. Within 2 business days of the completion of this webinar here, we're going to put that up on our website for our consumption and for everyone's free viewing on this public webinar. So you'll see it there. I'll send you that email within the next couple days here. Someone said competent is demonstrated skills and ability. That's perfect, right? So competent is getting you there, right? And I would definitely say that to be qualified, you need to be competent. But if you're competent, you're not necessarily qualified, right? And so you can be a competent worker, but still not quite have made it to the threshold of being qualified. So that's really all I have for you. I'll take one more moment to let any other questions come in. But in the meantime, if you want to learn more, well, we here at TPC Training, I mean, our our wheelhouse is getting people the electrical training they need. It's really a big selling point of what we do. We offer, you know, basics of electricity all the way over to arc flash electrical safety and advanced electrical troubleshooting. We can really help you kind of define the path that you can get to get from where you are now to a qualified electrical worker. And we can even come visit you and kind of see what your machines look like and all that kind of stuff and really help you. So all it takes is just emailing us and telephoning us. It doesn't cost any money to just get a little advice from us by calling the phone and seeing what you can do to get your people on the path toward being qualified. So let's see, we got a couple more comments here. As an employer, if you deem someone qualified and there is an accident, how does that relate to liability on the employer? That's a great question, really great question. So that really is the main reason why I say if it wasn't written down, it never happened, right? Because you're keeping that paper trail and keeping that record of each step along the way this person reached to be qualified. Okay? So the more that's written down on what your company believes it takes to be qualified, the better you would be in the hopefully very rare, if not non-existent, right, event that someone gets hurt in an accident. Because what's going to happen when an accident happens? OSHA is going to knock on your door, right? And you're going to be having an investigation into what happened during that incident, an incident investigation. And they're going to ask, the first thing they're going to ask is, was that person qualified? And you can say, hopefully you can say yes. You can say yes. And then the next thing they're going to say after you say yes, that person was, of course we qualified that person. They'll say, prove it. Right? And so they'll say, prove to us that you gave them the skills, the knowledge, and the safety training requisite to be qualified in your facility. So hopefully at that point, you would need to produce records of your clearly documented requirements on what it takes to be qualified and why it pertained to the job he was doing, and the specific moments of time in which the training was administered and delivered to that person and what they learned during that training, right? All the documentation. So maybe you can even point to the specific moment that this person learned the specific tasks that they were supposed to be doing the correct way at this date and time. It's hard to do, and I know it's really a work in progress for a lot of companies. But that's really something you got to be aware of. And let's see. When it comes to liability on the employer, the liability almost never falls. For any accident on a job site, the liability almost never falls on the lap of the employee that got hurt. Okay. Even if the employee might have been the most careless employee ever, where they weren't paying attention, or they were rushing, or they just frankly didn't care enough, or they were distracted, or they were mean-spirited, or they were whatever. As much as you might disagree with the employee, OSHA will always side with the employee during an accident. It'll come down to, okay, that person was, hard to work with, then why didn't you train them to work the correct way? Right? This person was rushing, well, why didn't you train them not to rush and how to avoid rushing? This person was, not doing it the correct way. Well, did you train them to do it the correct way? And when did you do it, right? All that kind of, if it wasn't written down, it never happened. The more you write things down, the better you are, period. So I hope that really helps answer that question. Let's see, we got some other great questions coming in. Let me see if I can sift through them for us. Let's see. Training to human error. Oh yeah, so there's always the aspect of human error, right? And there's always kind of the wild card of people just make mistakes sometimes, right? And that's really what the risk assessment process of being qualified is all about, because we know that we're human and that we're imperfect and that things can go wrong, right? We can be testing and troubleshooting on a 480 volt cabinet and suddenly we sneeze, right? Or we lose our balance, or we have a twitch or a spasm or whatever. And the meter leads go where they're not supposed to and cause an arc flash and maybe some serious injury. So really it comes down to, is the qualified person knowledgeable enough and competent and able enough to reduce the risk of, even if there is human error, this person won't get hurt in the event of we get this all the time. Hey, I'm just going to go into this panel. I don't need those electrical gloves. I know I'm not going to make a mistake. I'm just going to test, line 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 1 to 3, test for voltage, and then close the door. I'm not going to make a mistake. I've done this 100 times, right? But it's the 101st time that you do it that can be the end of you. So really knowing PPE requirements, right? Knowing how to correctly wear PPE, or better yet, PPE is actually the last thing you consider in the event of risk assessment. And again, we get more into this in our arc flash safety class. The top thing is eliminating the hazard altogether. Proper lockout, tagout, and complete de-energization of circuits is really what qualified people should be working toward. Inspecting a worker's work at least once a year, great point. I'm going to take us back. I'm going on my slide sorter right now. I'm taking us back to this guy. So take a look in Article 110.2A3. Okay, hope that helps. When you go there, you're going to be able to see where they kind of dig into the requirements of retraining your facility people. Let's see, I think that's all the ones I can see that I can answer readily here. So I really appreciate you guys being here. This has been a really helpful event, and I really like your curiosity and seeing kind of what you're thinking. So yeah, having qualification cards, that's a good way to implement qualifications. Basically any way to document and show that someone's qualified to do one job versus another, the better you are. Anything written down in card format, in paper, in a file cabinet somewhere on paper, or better yet, electronically, right? Kept electronically on a shared or secure file that you can always access to know who's qualified and who's not. And I would agree 100% with this last question and comment, and that is, would you agree that there's never zero risk, but the employer should qualify the employee to the minimum standard? Absolutely. That's what it's about. You walk out your door in the morning, right? And you're already assuming some risk for yourself by tripping and falling, or getting in your vehicle and all this risk associated with that. So really, there's never such thing as zero risk, but there is a way to minimize the risk as much as possible, and that's what a qualified electrical worker should do. So thank you all for being here. This has been really beneficial, and I hope you find this something you can come back to as your discussion, where you can start learning about a qualified electrical worker. And again, always contact us at TPC Training to learn more about what it takes to get you there to being a qualified electrical worker. Thanks so much for being here, and have a great day.